Ready then? Right, so this is the background to the program, and what I'm doing with the first few slides, and some of you around the table will have seen these before, is go back to the year 2012, because it was in January 2012, following on from Simon's story, that we decided that I would attempt to do some very, very basic quality control. You might prefer to call some of it quality assurance, but I'll defer to you. We can argue about these things later. But some sort of testing of quality of the products from Haith here. I'd done some of that sort of work as an ordinary vet, if you like, in the past, and I'm interested in bugs and so on. So I knew and bacteria, and I knew what I was looking for. But we introduced very tentatively that program in January 2012, 3 years ago. And then in April, I gave a talk at the British Veterinary Zoological meeting in Gloucestershire. A very short one, and I called it Bird Diets, Is There a Need for Quality Control? And I have to say at that stage that was revolutionary. I mean, I was interested they accepted the topic, because the vets all saying, well, yeah, is this really veterinary medicine? But my job was to show it is part of veterinary medicine. And so the first few slides will actually be exactly the same ones as I used 3 years ago. A reminder for those of you who've seen them before, and something background for those of you who are new colleagues. Next slide, please. The first point I made, and I'm going through this very quickly, is that captive birds are kept in captivity for many reasons. This is what I was saying to the vets 3 years ago in more detail. Birds are kept in captivity for various reasons, as pets in zoos, captive breeding programs, etc., ostrich farming, all those sort of things. And they depend, as part of their care, their management in captivity, on being fed properly. And that's in terms of both quantity and quality of diet. Next slide, please. I then moved on to say that wild birds also are fed. They are fed in Britain, in the rest of Europe. Food is put out in North America, Australia, New Zealand, and also in conservation projects all over the world. There are, for example, vulture restaurants where vultures, which have declined, as you probably know, dramatically over the past few years, carcasses are put out in the Alps and in India and in Pakistan and Nepal and so on to supplement their diet. But with that comes all the problems to which Simon alluded before. So wild birds are definitely a very, very important part, because as Simon said, we just don't know what happens to birds to which we give our diets. I should just point out this is probably the first publication, this book, Bird Gardening by Maxwell Knight, the first book produced in 1954, suggesting that you can actually attract birds to your garden, not just by having a bird table, but actually making the whole garden attractive to birds and indeed to other animals. So that was a landmark. You'll see our grandchildren quite often in here. They are part of the story. Next slide, please. I then drew attention, as I do again today, to what I've just mentioned, and that is food-associated health hazards. And this is some of the literature relating to that, and there's pictures of bird tables here, clean and not so clean. These are the various publications that have appeared talking about how salmonella, which is a bacterium and which can affect us, or certain types of salmonella can be acquired by wild birds. Dozens of greenfinches can die of this or other species. There are all kinds of diseases, infectious diseases, that can either be transmitted by an inadequate diet, or even if the diet itself has not done it, because the diet's been put out somewhere and perhaps it's not of the best quality, so molds and things grow on it there, it then picks up infection and spreads it to other birds. So there are very, very important reasons for protecting wild birds, and indeed the people who handle these diets and put them out in their gardens, because they are coming into contact with the same bugs. Next slide, please. I drew attention, as Simon did earlier, to the fact there's a whole range of bird diets in Britain. You can pick up diets not just from Tesco. Next slide, please. If you go to King's Lynn, where we live, this is the central market area. Margaret's in there. She's posing. I didn't want them to see I was photographing their bird diets, but in fact she's standing here next to these to this particular stall, and they've got bags and bags of very roughly packaged up bird diets, and some of these sit there in the summer for week after week, you know, and they're getting drier and they're deteriorating all the time, and it's some of those I did my early testing on. Next slide, please. So I then talked to the vets about what the important considerations of diets are, and of course we'll be discussing this later, and Simon's alluded to things like cost, etc. But I mean, the most important thing probably initially is that the diet is acceptable to birds and it's palatable. And you've only got to think in terms of humans, you know, whether you like a particular breakfast cereal, or if you go to a cafe or restaurant, whatever, what you choose. Individuals vary, and so humans, and so also do birds. Next slide, please. And then I listed, and this list again, it goes back 3 years, the methods of investigating foodstuffs. And this may look a long list, but there are all kinds of other things that could be done. And it starts off with fairly simple tests, and those are the ones that I've been concentrating on, right down to ones down here, X-ray microanalysis, scanning electron microscopy. That's actually transmission electron microscopy, but I don't need to tell you, it's an expensive, sophisticated technique. It is used in human food analysis, it's used in domesticated animal food analysis and in the agricultural industry, but not, as far as I know, anywhere in the world on bird diets, but one day it'll happen. Next slide, please. And then I highlighted the ones that I felt, on the basis of my initial studies in 2012, we could do easily. Gross examination, including use of hand lens. In other words, looking at diets, and I know Brian and Carl do this, and some of the others, some of the rest I always do, and say I'm indebted to Haith, and this is the original picture from 3 years ago, because they provided all the original materials so that I could develop this screening program, this laboratory I'll come on to that later, but that's how it started, a simple laboratory, basic equipment, a simple stereo microscope, etc. And what I was doing initially, and again these are pictures, I've done it, these are pictures from 3 years ago, basic examination, and I know Carl and Brian will recognise some of these sort of pictures down their own microscope. Simple flotation tests, and I'd like to do some flotation tests in the practical later, possibly, Carl, with a view to you and your colleagues taking on that part, because I can then move on to the bits that really excite me, which I think I can do better if I'm not doing flotation, because it takes time. Or the examination like that, and picking up things on different diets, looking for evidence of foreign material, which is what you've got there. Next slide, please. And then the other tests that I find so much more exciting, really, looking for things actually in the diets, little bits of hair, insects, staining diets, and I'll come on to that in a minute, not only to see if the starch is good quality starch, etc., but whether it's become denatured perhaps, whether there's any breakdown of products, whether there's too much fibre in there, etc., and lots of bacteriology, only using simple blood agar plates. I mean, we could expand this no end, but I just used 10. You kindly send me a range for 10 blood agar plates to come each month, and some of them, as I say, are here, and at the moment I'm restricting myself to those, but they're giving us some answers. Next slide, please. And then what did I say 3 years ago to the British Veterinary Zoological Society? And I will read these out if you don't mind. This is 2012. Most proprietary bird diets in Britain are not subject to analysis or screening other than visual and manual checks for apparent quality and consistency. That was what we thought 3 years ago, and I think that was fair then. Secondly, routine laboratory tests could help to ensure that products intended for captive and wild birds do not pose unnecessary health risks. I think we can agree with that. And thirdly, I said in a very immodest way, the simple screening techniques described in this lecture are proposed as an important first step towards a quality control programme. It went down very well. That's 3 years ago. And we've moved on since then. So next slide, please. What have we actually done since then? Well, since 2012, we've introduced in-house basic testing of products, Carl and now Brian, and we had Ian before, of course. So people in-house are learning and doing it very well, may I say. Use of more sophisticated laboratory tests that I'm doing with backup from colleagues at Cambridge Veterinary School. And this is good because we're getting them involved. It costs a little bit of money, but I think it's money well spent. And again, if I perhaps pass flotation on to you, I could do more at that end of the spectrum, but we can discuss it later. Improve paperwork, report forms and tracking. Very important in terms of chain of custody and tracing of information. Publicity and education. Diet creation, which I know is coming up later, nutritional analysis with research. This is the work with Andy Beer and Edinburgh. And then the last one here links with other projects, and I'll come on to that in a second. So very quickly, I'll move through these. The in-house testing at Haith. You can see some pictures here, some taken last year actually on the comparable training course, some that you will have seen in publicity. Some of the pictures are actually up on the windows here. But what has really cheered me, and I'm not just saying this, it really is great that staff from within Haith are now playing a part in it, because the best investment is by people who work for the company. It's fine having a boffin like me who comes in and says you can do this, you can do that, and dances around and tells you all the tests you can do. But at the end of the day, those of you who work for this company, this is your company, this is your work, and to have you involved is so important, and to me very cheering. So all of this, and Carl managing to use the very, very old microscope. Are you still using the same one?
Well, still using it.
Yeah, I know. I mean, it is so archaic. It's even older than I am, the microscope. But he has done wonderful things with that. And again, we have to think about perhaps updating that and perhaps getting you something a little bit better. But nevertheless, for 3 years, it has served us well. Next slide, please. And then these are sort of things, these are some of Carl's pictures. He produces nice pictures for us. He's an expert, of course, because he's worked here on things that I don't know about. If you when you do the tour this afternoon, don't ask me too many questions about the products, because I'm learning all the time. I learn from you folks, and hopefully you learn something from me in return. So that's very important. Next slide, please. And then what I'm doing is moving on wherever I can to more sophisticated techniques. I've developed better techniques for, particularly for the flotation, and I would only suggest if you take it on here, you do the simple water flotation. What I've been doing in order to pick up dust and to measure it is using different liquids, different concentrations, either salt, sometimes sugar. We don't tell this to all your competitors, but I mean, it's the concentrations that matter. But if you alter the specific gravity of the flotation liquid, then of course different fractions will float or sink or whatever. So I'm keen to do that, but if the simple water flotation were done on some samples before he came to me, it would give me more time. My lab, as you can see from this, I hope you can see, is now, it is a proper lab. It's got shelves, it's got pickled specimens, it's got all the things I love. If I died in that lab, I'd be, oh sorry, this is on tape, isn't it? I'd be absolutely happy. It's just like a shrine to me. I go in there and put the Radio 3 on, sorry, I'll stop in a sec, etc., etc. Now I have to say, since losing Emily, I've been trying to recruit more staff. My granddaughter and grandson here love the lab, but they're not willing to work for me. I don't know why, because I'm such an easy fellow to work with, as you can imagine, okay? And at Cambridge, this is the Cambridge Veterinary School here, one of Britain's 8 veterinary schools, and these are some histological sections, little slides. I've got some to show you. Let's pass these round. These are microscope slides, and these are the sort of preparations. These are not all of your products. It's just to show the range of stains, 2 hands if you don't mind, that we can do. Except it says thank you. There's a woodland kingfisher from Africa. I hope that's of some interest. Like everything else today, it's overrun. I'm sorry about that. Get the rungu out, etc. Nevertheless, it seems to have stimulated some discussion. I think it's very exciting what you have achieved in 3 years. But during the day, we've got to work out, I think, carefully how we can best utilise your own staff's time, my facilities, and particularly the growing links I have with Cambridge. I've always had links with Cambridge, but I'm building them again in the context of diets and with Leatherhead, so we really are leading the field in this area.